Action.
Action. All right. So this is the, I might need the mouse. So this is the installer script. The beginning contains, and this can be organized. You can put variables wherever you want, but I've just put all the global variables. All of the variables are global. There's no scopes. Everything is global. It's such a small thing that it doesn't need to have any kind of scoping. So I just put all of the variables at the top. These are used in various places through the code. The next section here is the includes. These includes are used for various functions, like this one says for checking if 64 or 32-bit. For checking the version of Windows, you download all these off of the NSYS website. They have all the descriptions and everything there. If you need if you like the checking processes, this will kill, and it will launch, and it will check to see if a process is running. Those three functions are contained within this NSH, and you'll see how those are called later once I get down further. The next section here is just a bunch of constants. These are default constants that NSYS uses to put your text over top of its little area using its design system. And recently I've added a custom product name here for some customization that's further than what you would be able to do canned. It contains a registry key, and this is all default stuff for the uninstaller. It takes care of putting your program in the control panel, add or remove programs, by just simply adding the key that you want to put your uninstaller where your uninstaller is located. You can see the product name, Synchro9.exe or no, Synchro Studio, is used as the key for what the product is named for that uninstaller. So this is the only line you have to have, and it will create an uninstaller and add or remove programs entry for you. Program install folder, that was recently changed from configurable to version 9. It's hard-coded now, version 9. There's sections. Usually what I try to do is create just some comment with like some lines to try to because it's all in one file, and because it's kind of messy, I've tried to kind of segregate certain areas that do a particular task. This task is these two functions are used for automatically selecting and deselecting sections at runtime, and what that means is you've seen in normal installers where it will maybe have a few components. Like for instance, you might install a SQL Server, right? It's going to have maybe some help documentation. It might have an API. You could select or deselect a bunch of those options. We're reusing that in the Synchro installer to select which kind of database you want to use in kind of a radio fashion, rather than a checkbox fashion. So these are making it so that when you select one, it deselects the other and makes them operate like radio buttons. And again, all this code is downloaded off of NSYS. You just search for what you want. You'll find an answer pretty quick. There's 1,000 people that use this, so at any given time. So there's this section here where it says MUI, that's Modern User Interface, and that's just one of the interfaces that NSYS has. I like the MUI the best because it's simple, and each of these constants are constants related to a label somewhere on the user interface. You can see that it's pulling an icon here, it's pulling the bitmap that it puts in the upper left hand corner, and I've tried to put the sizes for the bitmap so you can easily swap those out if needed. But you can see these are just filled out with all of the text that you're going to see in the installer, and if you take this out, like if I took out the welcome page title, it would put some default thing in there. It has its defaults for all of these, and these are the only ones that you define here are what you're overriding, which at this point is it's quite a few of them. Almost all of them have been overridden at this point because of the customizations needed to it. So this will make it easy moving forward. It'll be pretty easy change to just change the verbiage in here. And so you have all these defines, and you see there's some define. Define is a constant. This is some text, or this is a pointer to an icon, or something like that. You also have macros. Macro is just it's a pointer to some other code, and essentially when you're inserting, this is actually a good point here. When you see insert macro, that's essentially saying I want to insert the welcome page. So you're defining all the constants for the welcome page, then you insert the welcome page. That is page 1 when it pops up. That's what that is. Then you define all the constants for the components page, or for the license page, and the license page pops up. insert macro is the next page. You know, it's just made simple like that to where in order to make, if you want to add a new page to this, you put insert macro in the name of the page and it'll put the page there. If I want to put 2 license agreements, I could copy this and paste it and it would do next, and it would go to another license agreement and then click next. It's that simple. So there's really nothing else to say as far as that goes. I mean, each page you can see, wherever it says insert macro, it's a page, install file, the install files page, the finish page, you know. So you also have to set the language. There's a language file. There's another place you can actually change default text. If you can't find the constant for it, you can go into the language file and change whatever you want. So it's all pretty much open. And then there's at the top, you're gonna find just a bunch of helper functions that it uses. Again, there's no scopes, there's no classes or anything, so it's just a bunch of helper functions. So we have a file copy for copying files from point A to point B. That is after they're already on the target. So you extract a file copy copies from point A to point B. Exec and log, there's like 15 different ways to execute a program from NSYS. Exec and log was the one that we needed because what it'll do is it'll call the program, it'll wait for it to finish, it'll actually take the result, and not just the result code. There's an important difference between the two, because the result is 1, 0, you know, did it complete or is there some error result? The actual return values that it gives would be like what it would type out in the command prompt. That's actually being saved to the log file. And so that's important. So everything that we call, we want to know what happened to it. We want to be able to open up the install it log file, which is what this thing creates, and see exactly what it did and what failed. And, you know, and that's what we've been working on with the database issues. We've been reading the output from the calls to exec and log. So that's why that's custom there. And of course, I've tried to comment the best I could. I've made this initialize variables section, which kind of, there's some database passwords, there's some, you can see the path is sort of created here where the product install folder is put onto the installation directory. The user can change this installation directory on the select installation directory page. So this will, you know, it'll attach that folder to that. You know, we've got a function here that gets the current domain. You got a function, you know, gets current username. These are all things that are used for launching the scripts and checking, you know, the database stuff. It needs user and it needs domain sometimes. So that's all needed at other spots. And you can see here, it's really this simple. If you want to make a call to a Windows API, you see the kernel32 DLL function called getComputerName, EXW, is being called right here. It's returning the machine name. So you have the power to do whatever you want. You're not like restricted to what NSYS gives you. If there's a Windows DLL that has a function in it, you can just call it just like that using that calling convention. So, and there's always a Google, you know, somebody's done it already, you know. So then you have some more stuff like branding text is the little text that's in the lower left-hand corner of the installer. It says trafficware. The output file is super important, you know. That's one thing to note here is that this version, this little variable here, is actually being passed into the script on compilation. So it's like I think the call is make nsys.exe, and then you do like / ver _ equals, and there's like 9.125 whatever. The whole version goes in there, and then that gets planted onto the wherever you put it. That's also used in some of the. I think it's using some of these constants here, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, here it is, release, you know, 9 point whatever at the very top. So that's that comes in through the build. So if you're doing a manual build, and if you're doing like just a compile from here, and you're pulling all the existing DLLs and executables and stuff, and you're just going to build up, you're not going to do a full build from scratch. You're going to just build the installer. Then because you're not executing this through the build script, the version is actually going to remain like that. It's going to print out $_ver$ in the place where version normally would be, simply because you just compiled it from the user interface. Here's another helper function to get the .NET path. This queries the framework directory and checks to make sure you have version 4 installed. The old installer, what it would do would actually look at a hard-coded path. It would look at c:/windows/system32/framework, and you know, if for some reason your framework was installed to a different location, it wouldn't work. So I changed that to where it actually checks the registry, which is the right way to do it. Next helper function is just deletes all the database files in the data directory. Simple. This next function is this is the loop that will check to see what's running. You can see we're calling an external DLL called NSProcess, and it's calling the find process function, and it's passing synchro.exe to it. So there's just some basic. You have to use gotos, unfortunately, in this thing. That's how it works. It's kind of a old style of structure. So what it'll do is you'll say string compare the result from this. If it equals 0, do nothing. If it fails, go to the synchro not running tag. It goes to synchro not running and continues to check each one. If any of them fail, they go to this message box, which says synchro's running, please close the application. And then whether you click OK or cancel, it will go to whatever label you put here. So, and then you can see here if you click cancel, it goes to synchro term. If you say OK, it'll go to reloop, which sends you back through the loop. So it's going to constantly just keep checking and make sure you're not able to continue unless all of those programs are not running. And that function is called check fail synchro suite running, and it's in a few spots in the installer. And the reason that I put it in a few spots is because in case you get to a point somewhere where there's a pause, or even installing files can take sometimes a couple of minutes. If you happen to launch synchro halfway through that, you're going to have problems. Or if somebody else on another user account launches synchro, so it checks in a few times during the execution of the installer. Good. Okay. And there is this is something we just added to make sure that we're admin. You can see a dot on an it. Anything beginning with a dot is a canned function that it's almost kind of like an event handler. It's going to handle the on init event if it exists, and it's basically saying checks to make sure I'm an admin. If not, don't even bother running, because this thing won't run unless you're an admin. We've already discovered that the old installer wouldn't function correctly if you're not an admin, so we went ahead and just said let's make sure that this installer elevates and make sure you're an admin user or part of the admin group.
If it fails, does it tell the user because you're not admin?
Yeah, you can see here it actually says message box, administrator rights required.
Gotcha.
And then you click OK and it quits. And we can change that message to be something more friendly, but I think that's pretty straightforward. So we have these more helpers. Function to grab the XP SQL 2008 registry path. It stuffs these variables here, and it also prints them out. It's worth saying the detail print is what's going out to the log. So if you ever get to a spot where you want to make something for a tech later to look at to see why didn't it install, or for a developer to look at and say why didn't it install, go ahead and just do a detail print on it. You can't put too much stuff in the log, so just print whatever you're doing. And now you're getting into the sections. So there's two sections in the installer. One section is Windows 7 and higher, which is that OS, that's the OS type. There's two sections in the installer. One is for Windows 7 and one is for XP. It's basically, if you can think of sections as a fork in the road. What section am I going to install? The first thing that it does is initialize all those variables and set up the pages and all that kind of stuff. But then immediately it prompts the user, select what database type you have. And then from there it forks and goes, if you select the Windows 7 and higher database, it runs all this code. And then right below this section is another section called Windows XP version. And it's going to install the Windows XP version of that database and run all that code. So it's either or at this point. Just to whip through this Windows 7 section. And by the way, this is denoted by this section keyword. What section means is that on the component page, and if you look up at the NUI at the very top, it says there's a component page defined there as insert macro components. That's a special keyword that means make this an option. This is one of the options that you select, this block of code, because essentially that's all it's doing. When you say I want to install that, you're saying insert that code into what we do. So does that make sense? Okay. So this thing calls the check fail synchro suite running that I just talked about, initializes some variables, prints out some stuff to the log, and then immediately begins checking to see if you have, what you already have installed by checking registry keys. It installs it'll install it if it doesn't exist. This package right here is actually zipped up in a 7-zip format, and what I've done is I've actually zipped these up a little bit. I've compressed these a little bit heavier because computers are now fast enough to where they'll extract these files really quick, even if they're really tightly compressed. So I went ahead and increased the compression quite a bit from our last installer, which is part of the reason why we have a small executable size. But the only way to do that is to actually include a 7-zip plugin in NSYS, and there is one called NSYS7Z, .dll, and I'm actually calling extract. So what I do is I call file, which this is the path where I'm grabbing the file from, where the installer grabs it from. The out path is where it puts it to on the user's computer, and then now that the file is there, I'm calling extract on it. It's just going to, extract the zip in the current place that it's at, extract everything that's in it. What comes out of that is a file called sqllocaldb _64.msi, which is then called using the exec and log function. That runs the 64-bit local DB installer program right there in the installer silently. That's what that's doing. It checks to make sure that it exists. If it doesn't, obviously it fails out. And so the same thing, you can see here there's an if statement. It says if running x64, do this. If running 32, install the 32-bit package. So this is for the 64-bit code. This is for the 32-bit installer. It's the same thing. It just does it 64 or 32. Next, it does a very similar thing, but for a program called command line tools for SQL. That's so that we can run like SQL CMD and then like send it a query like right through the command line. Those tools need to be installed. They also are 64 or 32-bit driven. So there's two different packages, and so that's the same kind of thing. It checks registry entries to see if they exist. It extracts these are so small I didn't need to zip them, so they're only like a megabyte or two. So those are exec and installed. And there's a couple of SQL scripts, a local DB installed on that file. All this stuff is put out to a temporary directory and run to initialize the database, copy over all the MDF files, deletes the existing files if they're there, copies out the new ones. There's this registry key that we just added called DB type, and what that is before we would have two different versions of Syncro that we would send to customers. We would make one installer for XP people, and it would have compiler directives saying, if I've been compiled with this particular compiler directive, point me towards this connection string. What's that? Oh, no, I'm good. Thanks. The other option would be the Windows 7 local DB type database, different connection strings. So we would compile two different versions, the XP, Windows 7 version. They would have their own installers. They would be sent to clients, and they would build the connection string based on what was compiled in. We changed that so that Syncro now, there's only one version. It's going to dynamically check this key. Software Trafficware version 9 Syncro platform, DB instance and DB type will be set to local DB or SQL 2008, I think. And determine, based on that, it's going to then query the database or connect to the database that way. So we're writing that key. And so the next step before starting to bulk copy those Syncro files, the next step in setting up the database is called the CheckDB instance program. What that does is it brings the database online, creates the database instance, attaches the files, and then tests the query. Queries them to make sure everything's set up. And that is an external executable that's called in silent mode. And I'm kind of in the middle of working on that right now. But when I'm done, it's going to say we're going to NSExec, exec and log. It's going to exec that file with a silent switch, and we're kind of right in the middle of doing that. But that's essentially where that's going. The next thing is, of course, the Windows XP section. Windows XP, it installs a version of Server 2008. It's a little bit different than the local DB, but not that much different. It's going to check registry keys. It does have to, install some INI files and do stuff like that. So it's a little bit slightly different of a procedure for getting that set up, but essentially, it's setting keys and calling executables to set the database to where it's ready for Syncro to use it. Okay. pretty straightforward. One thing that is different is that it stops the current MS SQL Trafficware service and restarts it, and that's one of the differences between local DB and Server 2008. Server 2008 actually installs a service that we need to deal with. So I've put a simple SC service handler in there where it'll stop the service named this, and then start the service. Service is running. Oh, okay, no. This stops the service and then it checks to make sure it's been stopped, and it keeps looping until it's done. Or it doesn't loop, it actually just checks to see if it's still running one more time, and if it is, then it says unable to stop the service. There's no reason to loop. And so delete database files, and then it recopies in the database file. So very similar to the Windows 7 setup, it's just slightly different. Then it restarts the service in the same way, and makes sure that it's running, and then it gives you an error message if it's not. Then it runs a bunch of queries, and okay, the next thing is right below. This is the section end key. So now that Windows XP section is done, there's a few more things that are kind of sandwiched in between the main section. The main section is what's called after both of those sections run. So each of these are considered like features, like we install the Windows 7 database feature, or we install the XP database feature, and then we install the main program after that. So either of those two will be run first. Then there's a couple of identifiers here. A couple of descriptions are set for the UI. You know, when you hover your mouse over, it tells you it's the recommended install, you know, whatever. Sets those descriptions. And then we get into the main section. It does another check. After installing the database, does another check, make sure no Syncro is running, and sets the output path to the final dir. Final dir is a global variable set to where the root of Syncro is. So this is going to be Trafficware/version 9 in most cases. There's a little key here called set overwrite on. What that's going to do is it's going to overwrite existing files, complain when they can't be overwritten. In other words, I need to overwrite that file. So when you call set overwrite on, you're essentially setting a global flag saying that if I encounter a file, if I try to put a file somewhere and it's in use, give the user the ability to abort, retry, or ignore. But don't be silent about it. Don't just keep going. To turn that off, you set it to set overwrite off. And that's essentially going to say, if the file exists, don't even try to overwrite it. Just go along. There's a third option called set overwrite try. And set overwrite try we haven't found that to be very useful because it'll still prompt the user. And so the whole idea is like if you want it silent, you have to turn it off. If you want the user to be notified of it, you turn it on. So we call get.net dir, that function up there. Make sure that the .NET installation exists, and then we start copying files. And you can see here install files. It does another check for Syncro because I've encountered a few situations where I've double-clicked on Syncro and it started running, but it didn't actually launch right away. And then halfway through the installer, it actually messed up, had problems. So I started putting that in a lot of spots so that it would make sure that Syncro